When the deputies stopped the old black woman beside the railroad cut in the winter of 1867, they thought they had caught a drifter. Then one of them lifted the hem of her dress. 5 names had been stitched into the lining in blue thread. 4 of them were crossed out. The sheriff asked what the names meant. She looked at him with a face weathered hard by years, and said, low and steady, "Those are the men who bought my children." That was the moment the county understood the 4 dead planters had not died by bad luck at all. The woman in shackles was named Cora Duvall. She was 65 years old, with swollen knuckles, a slight limp in her left leg, and the kind of stillness people mistake for weakness right up until it costs them something. By then the papers were already calling her a murderess, a madwoman, a Negro widow possessed by vengeance. The white men who spoke that way did not know her story. The black families who packed the courtroom later knew exactly what she was. They called her a mother. 41 years earlier, on a morning so hot the cypress leaves did not move, Cora had been 24 years old, and still young enough to believe there were some cruelties a man would never commit in daylight. The debt men cured her of that. The owner of Cypress Landing, a rice planter named Elias Varn, had been bleeding money for years. First the storms, then the blight, then bad notes he could not cover. By August of 1826, he had run out of lies to tell his creditors. The books had to be balanced, and when a plantation man said that, it almost always meant black families were about to be broken with a clean pen stroke and a straight face. Cora was in the yard, washing shirts in a split cedar tub when she saw the wagons roll in. She knew before anyone told her. Not because she heard words, because the whole place changed shape around fear. Overseers stopped shouting. House servants would not meet her eyes. Even the women in the cookhouse moved carefully, as if sudden noise might bring disaster down faster. Her oldest boy, Isaiah, was chasing his brother Benjamin with a reed sword he had cut for himself the day before. Louisa sat on the steps plaiting strips of grass together for 2-year-old Clara. Baby Amos was on a quilt in the shade, fat wrists catching sunlight each time he kicked. That was the last hour of Cora's life that belonged wholly to her. The trader made them line up in the front yard. He did it beneath the broad front steps of the house, with white columns behind him and 6 horses breathing in the heat, as if the performance needed a grand stage. Elias Varn stood there with a sheaf of papers, and the desperate look of a man trying to call theft by some cleaner name. "Hold them still," the trader said. Cora did. What else could she do? She had been whipped before. She knew exactly how quickly white panic turned into iron and leather. So she put her hands on her children one by one, and tried to leave them something better than screaming. Isaiah first, 7 years old, serious eyes, too smart for the world he had been born into. Louisa next, fierce little jaw, would not lower her chin for anybody. Benjamin, only 4, leaning into Cora's skirt because he still thought cloth could protect him. Clara, with sleep still soft in her face. Amos, barely walking, reaching for the string tie at Cora's collar. The names were read out like cargo assignments. Isaiah to Colonel Harlan Raines. Louisa to Ezra Bell. Benjamin to Judge Thomas Weller. Clara to Silas Creed. Amos to August Pike. Cora heard every name. She fixed every face. She fixed the cut of every coat, the sound of every voice, the way each man looked at her children as though he were measuring stock. When she begged, Elias Varn slapped her so hard she fell into the yard dust. When Louisa bit the trader's wrist for taking Amos, they dragged the baby from her arms anyway. When Benjamin started screaming for his mother, Judge Weller laughed once, short and irritated, like a man bothered by weather. Isaiah did not cry at first. He looked at Cora from the back of Raines's horse, with a stunned, old expression no child should ever wear. It broke only when the horses turned. "Mama," he shouted then. "Mama, how you gone find us?" Cora rose with blood in her mouth and dirt ground into her palms. And because lies were all she had left to give them, she shouted back the only one big enough to hold. "I'll remember." The wagons rolled off. The horses followed. The yard emptied. By sundown the plantation looked the same as it had that morning. And that was one of the worst things about slavery. The world could keep its shape, while a woman's life was split open in the middle of it. That night, after the quarters went quiet, Cora took a needle, a scrap of blue thread she had hidden in her mattress ticking, and the dress she was wearing when her children were sold. She stitched 5 names into the hem. Harlan Raines, Ezra Bell, Thomas Weller, Silas Creed, August Pike. Paper could be seized, memory could be beaten, but cloth traveled. 2 months later, Elias Varn sold Cora to a widow in Charleston, who ran a narrow boarding house near the Cooper's yard. He could not bear the sight of her, people said. Cora thought it had less to do with guilt than with inconvenience. Grief made owners uncomfortable, reminded them that the things they called property had souls loud enough to trouble a room. Charleston changed the shape of her suffering, but not its purpose. At the boarding house she scrubbed sheets, carried coal, emptied chamber pots, and moved through rooms filled with white men who talked too freely around black women they had trained themselves not to see. Merchants, ship captains, factors, magistrates, rice agents, lawyers, soldiers. They spoke county names, river names, sale routes, probate disputes, estate dispersals, illness, insurance, prices. Cora listened. She became dangerous the way some women become prayerful. Quietly, daily, without witness. From draymen unloading barrels she learned Raines had taken Isaiah inland to a pine tract near Orangeburg. From a kitchen girl leased from the Bell place she learned Louisa had been put into house service because she was sharp-eyed and quick-fingered. From a groom who once worked for Judge Weller, she learned Benjamin had been renamed Ben, and made to sleep outside the carriage shed with the dogs, so he would learn obedience early. From a woman on a packet boat, she heard Silas Creed kept Clara near his sick wife, and liked to boast that little girls molded easily if you started young enough. Of Amos, she heard almost nothing. August Pike moved enslaved children in and out like livestock on a ledger. Mames vanished around him. Years passed. Then more years. Cora became what people in bondage often had to become for one another, when the law refused to see them as kin. A keeper of names. If someone lost a husband to a traitor, Cora remembered where the man had been sent. If a woman heard her daughter had been sold west, Cora held the county, the buyer, the auction yard, the steamboat route. She traded memory for memory, names for names, fragments for fragments. Black people carried whole family trees in whispers, because paper belonged to people who bought and sold them. Sometimes Cora learned things that let her breathe. Louisa had survived a scarlet fever season that killed 2 children at the Bell house. Benjamin had run away once at 10, and been brought back with welts on his calves, which meant he had spirit enough to risk pain for distance. Clara had a habit of humming under her breath when frightened, and one laundress who met her swore the little girl's face was so much like Cora's that it startled her. Sometimes Cora learned things that hollowed her out. Isaiah, she heard, was being worked in standing water and pine heat. Too thin. Coughing by the second winter. She carried that in silence because there was no room in slavery for a mother to collapse every time a rumor arrived. Then came secession. Then war. White boarders who had once spoken with plantation arrogance began speaking in clipped, frightened bursts. Stalled. Men vanished into uniforms. Hospital wagons rattled through the streets. Rumor thickened like smoke. Cora kept listening. Union ships off the harbor. Rice fortunes collapsing. The Bell family sending valuables inland. Judge Weller's son killed near Spotsylvania. Silas Creed drinking harder since his wife died. August Pike somewhere west of Columbia, then Macon, then maybe dead, then maybe not. When freedom finally came to Charleston, it did not arrive like a hymn. It arrived confused, hungry, crowded, and real. There were soldiers in blue. There were abandoned houses. There were black men walking without passes for the first time in their lives, and not quite knowing what to do with the width of the street. There were women standing very still because if they moved too quickly, the miracle might prove to be another trick. Cora did not weep. She went upstairs to the narrow room under the eaves, lifted the loose board beneath her cot, and took out the dress with the blue-stitched hem. Then she walked to the freedman's office with her back straight and her whole life folded over one arm. Freedom did not hand her justice. It handed her records. Some of them. A clerk with red hair and tired eyes searched lists and ledgers, and army notes and confiscation filings, while Cora stood across from him with both hands locked at her waist to keep them from shaking. Ezra Bell, he told her, had died of a stroke in 1862. Judge Thomas Weller was back in South Carolina, ruined but alive. Colonel Rains had lost most of his land, but still held the house. Silas Creed was living outside Camden with one daughter and a cough that sounded bad even on paper. August Pike had reappeared after the war in Georgia under his own name, running freight and general goods. Then the clerk found something else. A line about Isaiah. Not much. Just a church burial note copied into the office roll by a black sexton trying to help families find one another. Male. Colored. Approximate age 19. Property of Harlan Rains estate. Buried February 1862 after fever. Cora stared at the line until the letters blurred. That's all? She asked. The clerk swallowed. Ma'am, I'm sorry. Sorry. It was a small word. Too small for a boy who had once asked from horseback how his mother would find him. Cora went down to the harbor after that, and sat on an overturned crate until dark. That was the closest she ever came to breaking. Not when they sold her children. Not when Louisa was sent away. Not through 30 years of bondage. There, at the edge of open water, with freedom in the air, and her oldest son dead in a line of ink. A preacher found her there, and said the Lord would handle vengeance in his own time. Cora looked at the dress in her lap, and thought, maybe. Law had handled slavery in its own time too, and look what that had amounted to. The next morning she went back to the records office and asked a different question. Where do I find Colonel Rains? That was how the hunt truly began, not from rage alone. From the realization that no court in the country intended to name what had been done to her children as a crime. Rains was first. Cora reached his reduced plantation as a cook looking for work. Age helped her. Respectable white men almost never imagined an older black woman had come to kill them. They imagined service, obedience, background labor. She gave them exactly the version of herself that made them careless. Rains had shrunk since 1826, but cruelty had not. It sat in him like old iron. He complained through supper about freed people leaving, about wages, about insolence, about how the world had gone crooked since the war. He spoke of slavery the way bankrupt men speak of a lost inheritance. Injured the history had stopped arranging itself for their convenience. Cora served him sweet potato pie and blackberry cordial, with foxglove steeped low and patient underneath the sugar. When the first pressure hit his chest, he looked at her in confusion. She stepped closer. Do you remember a boy named Isaiah? She asked. He frowned as if she had asked about a mule he once traded. She did not let him die with confusion. You bought him at Cypress Landing. 7 years old. Thin wrists. Serious eyes. He died under your hand before he ever turned 20. Recognition came slowly, then fear. That was the mercy she allowed him. Understanding. By the time the houseman found Colonel Rains face down beside his table, Cora was already 2 counties away, sitting in the back of a produce wagon and sewing one dark line through his name. Thomas Weller came next. He was living in a rented house in Columbia, half sick and living on borrowed status. He still liked good coffee, starched cuffs, and hearing himself talk. Cora took work with the widow who kept his rooms and waited. Some revenges roar. Cora's move like mending. A cup placed here, a spoon turned there. Powder hidden inside bitterness. When Weller told her one evening that slavery had been unfortunate but necessary, that those people had been incapable of managing family life anyway, Cora nearly put the knife in him then and there. Instead, she watched him drink. Then she said, "My son managed to remember me for 40 years. That seems family enough. He died before dawn." Silas Creed took longer, because he had gone religious in old age. He lived on scripture and self-forgiveness, the favorite diet of men who had survived their own sins. Cora found him at a church supper outside Camden, smiling weakly, speaking of mercy, patting the hands of black children whose grandparents he would once have sold if money tightened. She helped in the kitchen, carried plates, and put bitter almond into the jam he spread on warm biscuits. As he began to choke and tremble, she leaned close enough for him to hear one sentence over the panic in his own body. "Clara learned fear from your house, before she learned her letters." Then she crossed out his name, too. August Pike was the only one who made her travel. He had drifted after the war, leaving ruined accounts behind him from Georgia to Tennessee, until finally Cora found him in a river town keeping books for a freight warehouse. Time had not humbled him. It had only made him sly. He did recognize her. Not at first by face. By hatred. There are some wounds a man can feel looking back at him. Pike tried to bargain as soon as he understood. Men like that always believed there was a price, because there had always been a price before. He offered money. Then records. Then apologies so thin they sounded insulting even by the standards of white men begging for life. Cora kept him talking. "Amos," she said. "What happened to Amos?" Pike's eyes flickered. That was answer enough to tell her there was something to know. "He was sold again," Pike said at last, breathing fast. "Downriver. New name on the paper. Didn't mean nothing by it, just business." The child had a chest rattle. "Maybe Louisiana. Maybe New Orleans first, I don't know after that. I swear I don't." For 1 second the room tilted. Not dead, maybe. Not saved, either. Just swallowed. That was the most terrible thing slavery did. It did not always kill cleanly. Sometimes it erased. Pike kept talking, voice cracking, insisting he could help her if given time. But Cora had already spent 41 years paying for his time. She used the knife on him, not poison. That was the name she crossed out with a steady hand in a boarding room above the warehouse, looking at the blue thread and understanding that one name remained open forever. Ezra Bell. Louisa's buyer. Dead before Cora could reach him. Dead without confession. Dead with whatever full map of Louisa's years he had taken into the ground. By then 4 white men were dead across 2 states, all connected to old slave dealings, all after encounters with one aging black woman who passed through kitchens and boarding houses like a shadow with perfect manners. Authorities finally started comparing notes. 3 days after Pike died, they found Cora walking north beside the railroad with her bundle, her Bible, the knife wrapped in cloth, and the dress in her satchel. The sheriff who arrested her was young enough to have no personal memory of slavery, which Cora found almost offensive. He read out the charges with the confidence of a man who believed law arrived clean. "Murder," he said. Cora looked at him for a long moment. "You finally learned the word," she answered. The trial filled the courthouse beyond capacity. White papers called it barbarity. Black church notices called it reckoning. The prosecutor painted Cora as a calculating fiend, proof that emancipation had loosed savagery onto the Republic. He called the dead men respectable citizens. He called the past regrettable but lawful. He called vengeance a disease. Cora's lawyer, a thin abolitionist from Boston, with a voice too soft for the room until it wasn't, asked the jury to sit with a simpler fact. 5 children had been sold from their mother's arms. 4 of the buyers had died. And for the first time in American history, the mother herself was being asked to explain why she remembered. When Cora took the stand, no one in the room moved. She told the truth plainly, because plain truth cuts deepest. She told them about Isaiah on the horse, Louisa fighting for Amos, Benjamin sleeping by a carriage shed, Clara learning fear in a pious man's house, Amos disappearing under a new name into river trade. She told them about the blue thread. I did not sew those names so I could hate forever, she said. I sewed them because I was afraid the world would finish what slavery started and make my children vanish completely. The names kept them real. The prosecutor asked whether she felt remorse. Cora thought of the harbor, of the burial line for Isaiah, of Pike saying, just business, of Louisa somewhere beyond reach for decades, of the country calling itself healed while black mothers still searched notices and church rolls for children stolen under law. Then she answered, I regret that this country left the bill with me. That line went into newspapers from Richmond to Philadelphia. What did not make every paper was what happened on the second day of testimony, when a black man in a faded Union coat stood up in the back after hearing Cora describe Benjamin's childhood habit of rubbing 2 fingers together before sleep. The man did it himself without realizing. Cora saw it from the witness chair and stopped speaking. He was older now, broad through the shoulders, with a scar at the hairline and eyes she knew before her mind caught up. Then, she said. The courtroom did not breathe. He came forward slowly, as if afraid speed might wake him from it. He had another name now, Benjamin Cole, taken after the war from the first free man who helped him read his enlistment paper. He had served with United States colored troops. He had spent years looking for family through army rolls and church records and freedmen notices. He had found mention of a woman named Cora Duvall in connection with the trial, and come as fast as trains and borrowed horses could carry him. When he stood close enough, he touched the blue-stitched hem of the dress laid on the evidence table, and started to cry without sound. That was how Cora knew, not because blood announces itself, because memory does. Benjamin's testimony changed the room. He told the jury his mother had not invented pain to excuse murder. He told them what Judge Weller's house had been. He told them he had found a letter trail that suggested Louisa survived the war in Savannah, married a Cooper, and had 2 daughters of her own. He did not know where Clara's line ended. He had never found Amos. But the family had not been erased as completely as the country preferred to imagine. The verdict was guilty. It was always going to be guilty. But perhaps the judge had listened harder than the prosecutor liked. Perhaps even he understood there was no sentence clean enough for a nation that had legalized the sale of children, and then pretended private revenge was the first violence worth condemning. He spared her the gallows. Cora was sent to prison for life. Years later, people would argue over whether mercy had been shown to her. Cora herself did not use that word. Mercy was what Louisa had tried to give baby Amos when she clung to him in the yard. Mercy was what no one had shown Isaiah in fever. Mercy was not a judge saving an old woman after the state had used her whole life up. Still, prison was not the end. Benjamin came whenever work allowed. So did a letter from Louisa. Finally, written in a careful hand by one of her daughters, and signed with a name Cora had once shouted across a yard while horse hooves tore her world open. The paper smelled faintly of bay rum and starch by the time it reached the prison, and Cora held it against her mouth before letting anyone read it aloud. Louisa remembered the blue thread. That detail undid Cora more than the words. Not because it proved the past had happened. She had never doubted that. Because it meant the children had carried some piece of her with them through the decades, the same way she had carried them. Cora grew old by a window that overlooked a strip of river and winter trees. She mended clothes for other inmates. She wrote names for freed people still searching family lines. She listened to young women talk about husbands, wages, schools, and churches. And sometimes she thought how strange it was that history could hold both whip scars and spelling books in the same handspan of years. Near the end, Benjamin asked whether she wanted Ezra Bell's name crossed out at last. He meant because Bell was dead, because the debt could never be collected, because maybe peace required a finished ledger. Cora shook her head. "Leave it open," she said. Then she folded the dress over his hands, not as evidence, as inheritance, so nobody could ever say the children had disappeared without witnesses. So nobody could ever call the crime unfortunate and move on. So somebody after her would know exactly how memory becomes the only justice left to people the law once sold. That is why the story endured. Not because 4 men died. Because one mother refused to let slavery have the final edit. And when people asked later what kind of woman Cora Duvall had been, the best answer was the first one she gave the sheriff beside the tracks. "Those were the men who bought my children." Everything after that was just the country being forced, at last, to hear the sentence all the way to the end.